Well, the moment has arrived. This is it. At least that's what Anthony Morris said at the 2018 annual meeting. That was the theme of his talk, introducing the new King of the North, which, as you probably know, turned out to be the old King of the North. It's kind of like that old rock song, Meet the New Boss, same as the old boss. But after 20 years, since 1998, when the Watchtower published the Pay Attention to Daniel's Prophecy book, when the Watchtower said, "Who is the King of the North now since the dissolution of the USSR? We don't know." But after 20 years now, it's out there. It's Russia and Russia's allies. And they mention that several times, but we never do get a clear picture of who Russia's allies are, nor is it ever mentioned who the King of the South is. But anyway, I thought I would play a few segments. I had to sit through the whole thing to sift through it, and it was, I must say, rather excruciating. But if you'll pardon me, I'll play a few segments and comment upon them. So let's give our attention here to Brother Anthony
I think
Morris.
all of you would agree how much we enjoyed the museum video and hearing Brother Fred Franz, his voice, talking about after the assassination of the Archduke, that the brothers said, "Ha, there it is. There it is, what we've been waiting for." Well, that's very stirring, and then we would have the critics saying, "Yeah, but you people had other expectations that were not realized," and et cetera, you know. But it's amazing that even the world recognized this was unique, 1914. See, in fact, I've had this for many years. I want to show it to you. It's the New World magazine, and it was widely read at the time, and I guess I remember about 1931 they went out of business. But here, End of All Kingdoms in 1914, Millennial Dawners 25-Year Prophecy. Widely read, other newspapers covered it. They made comments here about the terrific war outbreak in Europe has fulfilled an extraordinary prophecy. For a quarter of a century past, through preachers and through press, the international Bible students, best known as Millennial Dawners, have been proclaiming to the world that the day of wrath prophesied in the Bible would dawn in 1914. Look out for 1914, has been the cry of the hundreds of traveling evangelists.
Well, yes. I would have to concur with those words. Look out for 1914. It is the biggest fraud that has ever been perpetrated upon a trusting people. It's interesting that Brother Morris must have had that newspaper laminated. When he mentioned I think he said New World magazine, but I researched it on the internet. It's New York World magazine. And it indeed carried this article in August 30th edition. I think he mentions that later on, so I'll withhold that comment. But looking up New York World on Wikipedia, it was the originator of yellow journalism. In other words, sensational journalism. It published articles that were not so well researched. It was the beginning of what is called tabloid journalism. It's the fake news. It was one of the fake news magazines, and it had this sensational article. And Anthony Morris is not embarrassed to hold this up as proof that the Bible students were right about 1914. And there are the headlines: the end of all kingdoms. That was 100 years ago, right? 104 years ago. The end of all kingdoms. Well, Can you think of any kingdoms that ended? Well, yeah, the Austro-Hungarian Empire ended in World War I, and the Ottoman Empire. But the world has gone on, hasn't it? Nations have developed in ways that were unimaginable in 1914. The nations haven't ended. They've gained power. What kind of a con job are they trying to pull? Well, I've spoken so much upon that issue. I won't go into the man of lawlessness or the fact that when Jesus spoke of Jerusalem being trampled on by the nations until the appointed times of the nations have ended, he wasn't speaking about the trampling of Jerusalem by Babylon 5 centuries earlier. He's speaking of a future trampling. I don't know why Jehovah's Witnesses can't understand that, but that's for them to sort out, I guess. Well, anyway, he's developing his theme here. That this was the aha moment. This is it, 1914. Let's see a show of hands. How many were there to realize that this is it? How many of you out there? None, right? If you were alive and aware of what was going on in 1914, I congratulate you. You're no doubt in the Guinness Book of World Records as the oldest living human being. In reality, there's no one among those Bible students anyway who witnessed this and could say, this is it. So that generation that saw this is it, they're all gone. So it wasn't it. Brother Morris poo-poos the idea that the critics say, well, not everything you said was going to happen happened. And I guess I'm one of those critics. Because, well, the Bible students, as we know, were expecting Armageddon. They actually believed in the rapture. They thought they were going to be taken home in 1914. And Brother Macmillan in his book wrote how they sold their winter coats in the summer of 1913, I guess, or 14, I don't know. I'm sure they had to find some new apparel as the New York winter set in. Now, going back to that New York World magazine, back then, Pastor Russell, he used his millions to promote the Watchtower's message, and his articles were published in hundreds of magazines and with newspapers, daily newspapers. So I'm wondering if he didn't pay the New York World for a little publicity. I wouldn't put that beyond him at all. But maybe I will speak a little bit about that. When Paul spoke about the man of lawlessness, he warned not to believe these sensational claims that the day of Jehovah is here, the presence has begun. Do not be shaken from your reason. It will not come until the apostasy comes. And he spoke about the man of lawlessness and how that is an operation of Satan that Jehovah allows to go to those who know the truth. And Satan joins in with every powerful work and lying signs and every unrighteous deception. Do you think it's beyond the power of Satan to whip up this hysteria, as it was, among the Bible students that the world was going to end? And of course, they believed that Christ's parousia had already begun in 1874, and they were not disabused from that folly until 1930. So Brother Morris is not being sincere, because nothing that the Bible students expected to be fulfilled was fulfilled. Okay, there was a war. Well, are we saying that there cannot be another war? One that would be much worse than that First World War? The Watchtower says, no, there can't be. But here we are on the edge, as I've been preaching about. Well, let's get into this next segment and see what else he has to say here.
And I did appreciate very much how the yearbook in 1975, considering our modern day history, made this beautiful quote: disappointments about going to heaven in 1914 really were very minor compared with the great expectations realized in connection with that year. And it's amazing, during the first 6 months of 1914, nothing happened. And they were being ridiculed, and then the Archduke is assassinated. This one was particularly released August 30th, 1914. Millions dying in World War I. So it's Brother Franz's statement that really gave the idea for the theme here. This is it. The question arises, will we have one or more times in the future, or even now, when we can say, this is it? So you didn't have that same exciting fervor because of Bible prophecy. Well, let's begin with this one here. Find Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11. And we're going to read here verse 40, or half of it. In the time of the end, the king of the south, here in Daniel 11:40, will engage with him in a pushing. So, the governing body has been prayerfully considering recent events. And we know that in 1991, the Soviet Union came to an end. So who is the king of the North? Well, after prayerfully considering it and the matter of the pushing, we're assuring you that what we see after prayerfully considering it is that Russia and its allies, king of the North. Now, here's some reasoning. See, the Soviet Union disbanded. Russia came up from the rubble of the Soviet Union along with its allies. And here's some of the facts. Two things have become apparent. Russia and its allies are continuing to engage in a pushing with the king of the South, and we'll get to that pushing point shortly. And the second, they are taking the lead in persecuting and opposing God's people. Now, notice what the pushing includes: electronic espionage, computer attacks, trade wars, and that's what they call them, and the hostile flooding into surrounding territory. These are recurring features of the news headlines. You're aware of them. So someone, well, has the king of the North been inactive? Well, no. It appears he's never been this busy with the pushing with the king of the South. So this is it. At this point, we're confident to share with you Russia and its allies are the king of the North, and they're engaged in this pushing. In fact, last month, they had the largest war games, Russia did, since the Soviet Union was in existence, way back in the 80s. And they had their allies with them in the war game. So we're confident this is it.
Well, there you have it. About that New York World magazine, he mentioned it was published in August 30th, 1914. Archduke Ferdinand was killed, I think, June 28th. All the nations of Europe were allied with opposing alliances, and one after the other, they declared war on each other. The war didn't really begin then. Millions weren't killed in August. The troops were on the march, that's true. So this New York World Magazine came out going on about this extraordinary prophecy before the bloodletting had even begun. So that article was based solely upon this chronology, this 7 times chronology that Jehovah's Witnesses cannot get dislodged from their minds. It is the proof of everything. But as I said, it just doesn't work with the appointed times. Anyway. Well, you notice that Anthony Morris, he cited recent events, and he cited the electronic espionage. I'm sure he was alluding to the supposed election meddling, trade wars. Russia did not instigate any sort of trade war. In fact, Russia's economy is in no position to instigate a trade war. Those trade wars were orchestrated from London and Wall Street and became official U.S. policy to punish Russia and China. It wasn't something that Russia invented. The United States is trying to block off Russia from even selling oil and natural gas. They want to choke off Russia. They want to conquer Russia. They want to bust it up into smaller nations. And this has been the goal of the British for many, many decades. It's very disingenuous on the part of the Watchtower. It was a couple of years ago, a Watchtower article was bemoaning the fact that they receive such bad press coverage, no doubt about their child abuse cases and their out-of-court settlements and all of that. And they were sternly rebuking Jehovah's Witnesses for believing these stories from the press that's controlled by Satan, the devil. And the Watchtower boldly, confidently told Jehovah's Witnesses the JW.org has a website and they have press releases on there, and that's all the information you need. It's all right there for you. If you go to the press releases on JW.org, do a search for child abuse, you will not find one article. Not one article. So, child abuse doesn't exist in the Orwellian world of the Watchtower. Don't believe the news. Believe what we say. It didn't happen. But now, Anthony Morris is saying, well, you read the news. These are headlines. So they're basing their understanding of world events on a source which, by all accounts, is propaganda. And we're talking mainstream media, BBC, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC. They are outlets for imperial propaganda. Apparently the Watchtower doesn't accept that, even though they say this is Satan's media. Don't believe it. Now they're basing their interpretation of prophecy upon what the media says Russia is doing. For instance, Anthony Morris said that Russia was, and her allies were invading other countries. Really? What countries has Russia invaded? Can you name one? Oh, they invaded Ukraine. Did they? Everybody has, handheld phones and cameras. Let's see some footage. Can someone show some footage of Russian tanks and army men in Ukraine? Let's see some war footage. There isn't any. In reality, Ukraine was taken over by a Nazi coup backed by the United States. They immediately declared war on ethnic Russians, mostly in eastern Ukraine, and Russia sent troops to defend them because the government of Ukraine started shelling its own people who happened to be ethnic Russians. And then Crimea, which had always been part of Russia and was given to Ukraine by Khrushchev in the 50s, they had a referendum and voted overwhelmingly, like 96%, to return to Russia. And that was spun by the Western press as an invasion. They claim they believe in democracy. They didn't accept what the people of Crimea voted to do. No, that was a Russian invasion, and we've got to punish them. And Anthony Morris believes this nonsense and propaganda. And so do Jehovah's Witnesses, because they have to believe what this governing body says. The most ridiculous aspect of this, he read the verse there in Daniel, during the time of the end, the king of the south will engage with the king of the north in a pushing. And he insisted that this confrontation between the United States and Russia is the fulfillment of that prophecy. They're locking horns, they're pushing. Well, for one, this confrontation is totally contrived by London and the U.S. If you recall, when Donald Trump was merely running for the president, he said, what's wrong with having peaceful relations with Russia? There's a lot wrong with it. If you're part of the British oligarchy, they've always tried to divide the United States and Russia, going back to the Civil War, when Britain backed the Confederacy. I've spoken about that. I don't want to go into it. But again, this entire confrontation is manufactured by the British Empire, because they know that since, well, Anthony Morris spoke of Russia and her allies. He didn't mention who they were. How about the BRICS? It was an organization formed about 5 years ago, an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, and China. That organization is developing into a rival organization of the decrepit, dying British imperial transatlantic system. It has its own bank to rival the IMF. It's developing this new Silk Road. It's uplifting entire nations out of poverty, particularly in South Asia, Africa. That is why the British are fomenting war to destroy the BRICS. And they're going to use the United States, drag the United States into yet another war. I read a quote the other day from Randolph Churchill. He was the son of Winston Churchill, who, of course, was the Prime Minister of Great Britain during the Second World War. And he was speaking with a fellow journalist, Walter Lippmann. And this is right after World War II. He said, you don't understand the British Empire. And I don't think very many do. He said, we drug you into 2 world wars, and we'll drag you into a third. Walter Lippmann being an American. So that's the dynamic here. London has always been the king of the North. Since, well, back to the Queen Victoria. When the United States broke away in 1776, there has been this constant war to reconquer America, to take over its foreign policy mechanism, its economy, which it has done, to use it as its dumb giant to further the aims of this imperial beast headquartered in London. Well, anyway, going back to Anthony Morris's interpretation here. In the time of the end, there'll be this pushing. Now, the time of the end, according to the Watchtower, was 1914. So this pushing originally began during World War I. Presumably, Kaiser Wilhelm and the Germans were pushing. But the prophecy goes on to say, but the king of the north will storm, and he'll overrun and subjugate the king of the south. The pushing doesn't continue. The pushing triggers this flood and ultimate victory for the king of the north. You know, the Watchtower doesn't even get into that. They say that this flooding over occurred with Nazi expansion, and then it occurred again with Soviet expansion, and then they went belly up, and now we're back to the pushing again. So the pushing has been going on 100 years, still after the flood. Come on. And the king of the south was ruled over by the king of the north because during the Cold War, the Soviet Union bankrupted the United States. Reality is completely on its head from the Watchtower's version. But that's their this is it moment. These men declared this great and vital truth, and trying to whip up a little excitement among Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't think it's going to go over very well. And he said 3 times, did you notice that? After prayerful consideration. Well, maybe just turn the television off. Stop reading the New York Times. Maybe do some research into some alternative views of world events and history. That would be my suggestion, because that's what I've done. Anyway, I have no expectation of educating them or disabusing them of their folly, but we are witnessing something, I believe, quite extraordinary. I believe that the Watchtower has been used by God to publish the simple truth. The Watchtower does one thing very good. It teaches the basic truth. And it does that very well. It's published information in hundreds and hundreds of languages, helps meek and teachable people know the basic truth. They run off the rails with this prophecy, and they accept this delusion that Christ began ruling in 1914. If we really appreciate that, the fact that they are being used, but they are diluted, then we can understand some very fascinating prophecy. I would like to direct your attention to the 29th chapter of Isaiah, verse 9. He says, "Be stunned and amazed." This is Jehovah speaking. "Blind yourselves and be blinded. They are drunk, but not with wine. They are staggering, but not from alcohol. For Jehovah has poured a deep sleep upon you. He has closed your eyes," the prophets, "and he has covered your heads," the visionaries. Well, the Watchtower claims to be Jehovah's prophet, his mouthpiece. They boast that they're only they are able to decipher these visions in the Bible, making themselves visionaries. And here God says he's closed their eyes and covered the heads of their visionaries. That perfectly explains what we saw there with Anthony Morris. His understanding of who this King of the North is based upon recent events he saw on the news. Now, where's it going? Well, just to drive this point home and help us appreciate whom Jehovah is speaking about in this prophecy, verse 13 goes on to say, Jehovah says, "This people approaches me with their mouth, and they honor me with their lips, but their heart is far removed from me, and their fear of me is based on commands of men that they have been taught." Isn't that it? Don't Jehovah's Witnesses honor Jehovah? They speak about Jehovah. They declare his name. But God sees what the heart is. he sees that their act of worship and devotion is based upon commands of men. How could any of Jehovah's Witnesses argue that their faith is not determined by this governing body? Anthony Morris went on in that talk, went on about peace and security, and he he was rebuking Jehovah's Witnesses again for whenever some politician says peace and security, he said, then you start emailing each other. And he said, don't do that. We're the ones who say when it's it. Okay. Well, let me read verse 14 because I think it ties in quite well. He says, therefore, I am the one who will again do wonderful things with this people. That's a good thing, right? If God does something wonderful, he wants to bring them around, correct them. They're following men. They're not really devoted to him. He can fix that. With wonder upon wonder, and the wisdom of their wise men will perish, and the understanding of their discreet men will be hidden. The wise and discreet slave. He mentioned that a number of times, referring to the governing body as the faithful and discreet slave. And he was boasting how the Watchtower has been so discreet in not proclaiming the fulfillment of peace and security. Back in 1986, when the UN was talking about peace and security, the Watchtower was so discreet. Well, where will they be when Christ returns? They say he's already come. Then their wisdom will be hidden. They'll have nothing to say. They painted themselves into a corner. They led Jehovah's people down a dead-end road. Well, it goes on. This really hits home. How you twist things. Should the potter be regarded the same as the clay? And should what is made say about its maker, he did not make me? And does what is formed say about its former, he shows no understanding? Well, Paul referred to this prophecy and applied it to Christians, that they were the clay and Jehovah is the potter. The governing body pretend that, no, we are full grown, Jehovah doesn't mold us, we don't need to be molded. We've got it all figured out, we're the wise and faithful slaves, and so on and so on. Well, I won't go on anymore. I've written extensively on the book of Isaiah. You can check it out on my website. Also, I recently wrote an open letter, a bulletin, which I send electronically. I sent it to all the governing body members, by the way. This was just a few months ago after I had heard that they announced that Russia was the king of the North at their annual meeting in October of 2018. So I prepared a paper and sent it out. Has lots of references. If you want to know my thinking on identifying the king of the North and South, it will require some mental effort, a few hours of reading, studying, trying to understand the dynamics of this war between the British Empire and the American system. But that's the dynamic that's been moving the world and is leading it into the next world war. So anyway, this is it. Talk to you later.